G'day gamers, Aussie Wargamer here in Moree, Australia, and welcome to my channel. On this episode, I want to tackle the science behind colour, some advanced elements of colour theory, and how it applies to miniature painting. So let's get to it, eh? Well, I'm a high school art teacher in my other life, and I find colour and colour theory absolutely fascinating. Before we get started though, I want to acknowledge any of you who may be colourblind or otherwise visually impaired, and just say that the way that you see the world is no less valid than the way I do. So let's switch over to my screen now. The spectrum of visible light is relatively small compared to the other wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrums, between 400 and 700 nanometers. But it's crazy powerful and can do so much. We have two types of light receptors in our eyes. We have rods here, which distinguish light and dark, and cones, which distinguish colour. And of these cones, there are three rough types, which correspond to red, green, and blue-ish. These are what we call the additive primary colours, and while it can be argued that primary colours don't actually exist, it's a useful framework to have. Arbitrary, but useful. So at its most basic, colour is created when light is either reflected off or absorbed onto an object. So let's have a look at this tomato as an example. It's mostly red, meaning that most of the blues and yellows are being absorbed into the tomato, and the red is being reflected back from the tomato. I think this is really interesting because it means the colour that we see is exactly the colour that object isn't. Like, this tomato is absorbing all the blue and yellow, essentially making it green, but because the red is reflected back to us, that's what we see. Now you'll notice there are areas where the tomato is reflecting what we perceive to be white. It's not actually white, as we can see from these swatches down here, but because a second source of light is reflecting back, it appears much lighter. That's because of additive colour mixing. This is when different wavelengths of light are mixed and reflected back into our peepers. When the visible spectrum is mixed like this, completely, we see either white, as all the colours are reflecting back. So on that tomato, there's more light, which means we are seeing a much lighter shade of that red, as that white is being mixed in, or we see black as all the colours are absorbed. Some objects are more reflective than others, such as metal, so it's more likely to reflect back than something like cloth, which tends to absorb a lot of light. For a great video on this, check out Vince Venturella's great hobby cheating video on contrast, linked in the old notes below. This type of colour mixing poses a challenge for painters, miniature or otherwise, because when dealing with paints and pigments, we work in subtractive colour mixing. When we mix paints, each colour still absorbs all the light that it did before it was mixed, which means only the light that both colours reflect are still reflected back to us. So if we've got a warm blue here and a relatively warm red, and if we mix them together, we should get purple, right? The problem is, and we will, the problem is that this blue is reflecting blues and absorbing most of the greens and the reds, whereas this red is absorbing most of the greens and the blues. So what they're reflecting back is not a huge amount of light. So if we mix them together, what we get will be a purple, but it's this kind of murky, gross sort of purple that, just is not reflecting back a huge amount of light at all. Therein lies the problem. How do we put color on a miniature to make it look like it's reflecting the additive colors while using subtractive ones? I think the first lesson is that the more we mix colors, the less light is being reflected and the murkier they'll become. This can be both useful and annoying. Sometimes the murkiness can be what we're after if we want a grim, dark, or weathered look. But otherwise, it's best, I think, to keep to a single base, highlight, and shade color to mix between those colors. And this is why glazes are so useful and effective. Because a glaze is transparent, the light is partially penetrating through them. So you can see both the base color and the glaze color without losing too much of that light. It's also why contrast is really important in miniature painting. If you don't really accentuate the shades and highlights, your miniature tends to look flat because the paint is absorbing so much of the light. Well, probably most of us know about warm and cool colors. Warm colors being colors that are closest to red-orange, and cool colors being closest to green-blue. But of course, to say blue is a cool color is to ignore the vast array of colors that we call blue, some being warmer and others being cooler. So in comes color bias. No pigment or paint is ever truly a pure primary color. But if we take the colors closest to a traditional primary blue here, and if we add in a little bit of green, we're going to get a slightly cooler blue. And inversely, if we add in a little bit of red, we're going to get a slightly warmer blue. Coming into these purple tones here. We miniature painters can use this to create a really nice contrast or harmony by either putting warms and cools together, like this warm yellow and this cool yellow, or by using complementary colors of the same temperature, such as this warm yellow and this warm blue. Here's another interesting thing about color temperature. About 2/3 of the cones in our eyes are sensitive to longer wavelengths of light, which means we see yellows, reds, and oranges more than we see blues, greens, and purples, which are on the shorter wavelength side. So if we look at my water bottle here, for instance, the yellow text really stands out over the blues and the greens and the blacks of the bottle because our eyes are picking up more light from the yellow than from any other color. This has a couple of implications. First, it means that these colors are usually going to pop and be more vibrant. So we can, for instance, use yellow to highlight red, like I've done with this Vamp Lord, or use an orange as a spot color for mostly blue models, like on these blue horrors. But it also affects balance and contrast. Because warm colors are more visible, they tend to advance toward the viewer, whereas cool colors tend to recede away from the viewer. Take, for instance, this painting, the Mont Saint-Victoire, seen from Gardon, by Paul Cézanne. We can see all these beautiful warm yellows and browns and oranges in the foreground, in the buildings and in the grass here in the foreground, while the background mountains and sky is composed of cool blues and purples. You'll find this a lot in landscape art, particularly among the Impressionists, because it creates greater depth as the warm colors appear to advance and the cool colors appear to recede. If we remember this in our miniature painting, we can use it to create greater depth and contrast in our miniatures. If we look at this mini from the Warhammer Quest, upcoming Warhammer Quest, we can see the cool blues and greys here in the background on her pants and that kind of stuff, behind the warm greens and yellows in the jacket, and then a cool green back here to further build that depth. But probably most exemplifying is we see this warm wheat color in her hair, and that follows through to this brassy, goldy, warm color here. That really jumps out to the viewer behind the very cool neutrals of the horns and the bow and the arrow shaft. You can see it really coming forward and popping. So there you have it. Hopefully this video was helpful, or at least interesting. I'm fascinated by this stuff, and I need to incorporate it more into my mini painting because I don't incorporate it as much as I should. Well, let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and subscribe if you want to hear more of my voice. Catch us later.